I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about an FDA action that has killed thousands. So as usual, I'll start with the take-home message, and then in a minute or two, I'll launch into the full talk. So the take-home message is that steps taken by the FDA 20 years ago to reduce the likelihood of people dying from suicide caused by antidepressant medications has actually resulted in increasing deaths from suicide. And that's the conclusion of a recent comprehensive review that looked at dozens and dozens of studies, trying to figure out what happened since those warnings were put in place. That comprehensive analysis was released just a few weeks ago before Thanksgiving this week, and revealing what a turkey of a decision that FDA decision was. So FDA should be altering that black box warning because it is continuing to kill people, and it's an ominous precedent to have in place when we are about to put in charge of the FDA and Health and Human Services and other government agencies people who don't respect science or views that are in disagreement from their own. So, the detailed story. So the message, what happened is in October of 2003, the FDA issued an advisory, so public announcements that antidepressants had the capacity to increase the suicide risk in youth less than the age of 18. A year and a half later, in January of 2005, they insisted that a black box warning be put in place. A black box warning is the most severe reprimand the FDA can issue, short of pulling a drug from the market. So this was required to be present on all printed material and on all video advertisements related to these antidepressant products. And then 2 years after that, in May of 2007, the warning was expanded to include individuals 24 years and under. So not just youth of 18 and under, but anyone 24 and under. So the recent in-depth analysis conducted by Dr. Christine Liu, she's a pharmacist and an epidemiologist at the University of Sydney, also has appointments at Harvard with several collaborators. They looked at, again, dozens and dozens of studies. They looked at studies that had at least 5 data points, so they had to be studies that were conducted before and after these warnings were put in place. They had to have at least 50 subjects per time point. These were called interrupted time series analyses, so we can't do a control study. We can't put this warning in place and retroactively in half the country and not in the other half and see what happens. And I mean, even if we did it that way, there would be spillover of information. It's challenging to demonstrate, but there was remarked consistency in the studies they found, and they were comfortable in their ability to rule out confounding social factors, other changes in the world that were going on at that time that could have possibly explained these increases in suicide events that they saw. So they did not feel from the timing of it that this was due to the rise in social media, which has been a big phenomena. This didn't also correlate properly with the opioid epidemic, nor did the causes of death connect reliably to that. And it also, the 2008 recession in the U.S. did not seem to explain away the results. So what they found was that in the pediatric population, there was a very abrupt, reduction in visits to doctors for depression. This is all among the pediatric population. Some of these findings were also found in other age groups, but I'm going to focus on the pediatric. 2, there was a reduced number of depression diagnoses being made. Again, it's highly unlikely that depression itself plummeted at that time. It's just people weren't coming in and weren't being evaluated. Number 3, this didn't even solely affect medication use. There was a reduced number of psychotherapy visits. So people were really scared off from getting referrals or evaluation from depression by these warnings that drugs associated with it, out of fear that their doctor would recommend medication for them or their child. 4, there were measurably remarked reductions in prescriptions for antidepressant medications, and there was an increase, number 5, the big point, in suicide deaths and The conservative estimate is that in the first 3 years of these policies being in place, there was an excess, so an increased number of at least 2,500 suicide deaths. It's harder the farther we get out from having this in place to compare where things might have been without it, but that results in at least thousands and thousands of excess deaths from people avoiding treatment because of fear. If they get evaluated for depression, they will be put on a medication which could make them kill themselves or encourage them to kill themselves. The intention of putting this warning in place was that both patients and doctors would be monitoring more closely, particularly suicidal thoughts, actions, intentions, feelings in the first few weeks after starting a medication. And there's only one formal study that's looked at that extensively. And unfortunately, they found no change in how often depressed patients were being reviewed or called in for follow-up after starting antidepressant medications. So the one hope for intention did not even seem to be borne out by putting these warnings in place. So I'm going to go back and do a little more background to provide context. So in 1988, Prozac came onto the market. It was the first SSRI in this country. Citalopram came out a few years later in Europe. Within 2 years, Prozac had soared to the number one antidepressant in the US. Lots of people think that it was more effective. It worked better. It's not that it works better. It's that it was much safer in overdose. So the standard antidepressants at the time were the tricyclic antidepressants, which many people at a therapeutic dose in overdose, several weeks worth of medicine could kill you. Prozac, you'd probably have to consume several months worth, and even then you're more likely to sleep for a long time than be dead. Mostly cardiac arrhythmias that result in killing people from the tricyclics. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors also had serious risks of death and overdose. And not just serious side effects, but the majority of individuals on the tricyclics had weight gain, had sedation, had sexual side effects. And although some of those side effects are present with some of the SSRIs, it's a considerably lower extent, and particularly weight gain is less prevalent among SSRI users than among tricyclic users. And the fourth, and maybe this in some ways the most important reason for the explosion, is that partly because of their safety and other factors, the SSRIs, including Prozac, are very easy medications to titrate. Most individuals can start at an effective dose. So you go in, told to take 1 pill a day. There can be good reasons to start at a lower dose for many people, but many people can start at the effective dose and come back in a month. Again, that's not recommended waiting that long. So one thing this resulted in, at the time before SSRIs got on the market, about 3/4 of the prescriptions for antidepressants were made by psychiatrists. For the last decade or so, the rate of, or the percentage of antidepressants being prescribed by psychiatrists in America is about 20%. So we went from most antidepressants being monitored, prescribed by psychiatrists, to a small minority. Most of the people prescribing antidepressants right now are family practice doctors, internists, BJYNs, nurse practitioners, others who do not have particular expertise in mental health. So one of the things that Prozac kickstarted wasn't just an increase in the fraction of the market it dominated, again becoming number one. It measurably increased the rates overall of any antidepressant use. And with more people on antidepressants, people began reporting and noticing cases of individuals who appeared not to have had previous episodes of suicidality, who became actively and often had violent images or thoughts or feelings of wanting to kill themselves after starting these medications. And some of them actually went on to complete suicide, a phenomenon that has been associated with other antidepressants. It is not unique to SSRIs. So far, there is not clear and robust and consistent evidence that it's particularly associated with any one type or class of antidepressants. There were multiple lawsuits that drew attention to these cases. Interestingly, and I haven't been able to track down the number, of the reports are that Eli Lilly, the maker of it, was able to defeat in court most of the first several dozen cases brought on, and I'll get to why. And part of it is it's difficult to prove that antidepressants contribute to suicidality. Why is it hard? One is suicide, even though it is a major cause of death in the young population and throughout all ages in America, it's still quite a rare event. Most people aren't dying of anything most of the time. Suicide is a very uncommon event. It's hard to study, hard to detect rates in small populations unless you look at, on a massive scale, what's going on. 2, depression itself creates a substantial increased risk for suicide. Accounts vary, but probably as many as half of people with suicide who commit suicide are depressed. So we're already looking at a high-risk population. 3, people who are no longer alive because of their suicide attempt aren't available for any retrospective analysis, discussion, exploration of what triggered it. Did they really never have any previous suicide thoughts, or did they just not share those earlier? So that also makes it hard to study. Number 4 is people often hide suicidal thoughts from others. One of the most prevalent findings and consistently held up is that the majority of people who do commit complete suicide have seen a doctor or health profession in the 6 months preceding it, and very often those thoughts, desires were present at the time but were not revealed. Next point is the majority of individuals, just statistically, who have suicidal thoughts are individuals who did previously have suicidal thoughts. The last factor is that suicide rates, measurably in almost every study that's looked at that, are highest actually just before starting treatment. Suicide itself is a reason for bringing people into treatment. So how much of that heightened risk is still occurring after a first initial or 2 visits because they feel they're not getting help or not getting help quickly enough? So it's a perpetuation of the existing intensity of their depression. And how much is being caused by nuance of starting a medication is hard to sort out. But I think the evidence is fairly convincing that there are small numbers of individuals, particularly younger individuals, who do have new onset of suicide brought on by antidepressant agents. There are some experts who discount that and think that all these other reasons actually explain this and that there isn't a real phenomena underlying it. I think the data suggests there is, and it's, because of all these reasons, very hard to discern if this is a real effect for people above 25 or not. This is why the FDA felt compelled that we need to do something about it. We need to put in a black box warning. We need to warn people. But again, what clearly happened as a result was they scared people from treatment. There was more untreated depression. There were more suicides as a result, and that is ongoing to this day. So that isn't a unique problem or association. I mean, there's other issues with SSRI citalopram, also known as Celexa. In 2017, the FDA issued a warning at doses above 40 milligrams. There's a prolongation of part of the heart rhythm called the QT interval. We know that such prolongation is associated with increased risk for heart attacks, arrhythmias, bad outcomes. There are other drugs that also elevate or prolong the QT interval. Combining these drugs together increases your risk. It is something that people should be warned about and aware of, but they made a big to-do about this warning. Despite that, analyses have not found, the studies I've seen have not shown any serious cardiac side effects on people above 40 milligrams. So there's a theoretical risk. There's a measurable change in the EKG, the heart rhythm, but that does not seem to be represented in epidemiologic studies showing people on doses of citalopram above 40 milligrams dropping dead of heart attacks or other cardiac problems. So that would suggest the warning was somewhat overblown. Again, it's not that there's no concern, but we And there's at least one study done in the VA system where they had access to thousands of people's records, where in response to this government edict, many individuals were immediately dropped from doses above 40 milligrams to 40 or less. And what they found in the immediate aftermath of that was a 4-fold increase in death. Some of those were from suicide. So forcing people who were on higher doses to immediately decrease their dose killed people. And the message is that there were some people who really needed high doses of citalopram and who do quite well on it without adverse effects. Third sort of case study issue is Nefazodone or Serzone was actually removed from the market in many European countries. There were citizen groups pressuring to remove it from the market in the US, and the reason was risk of liver failure. So we know, and even the people proposing to remove it have not cited data that it's more common than this, but about 3 to 4 people out of 1 million on Nefazodone had liver failure, usually within almost all the cases were in the first 2 months of treatment. People died from liver failure. People needed liver transplants. This is a serious known risk. But is it worth warranting removal from the U.S. marketplace? I would argue strongly not. And why I would argue not? One is I would put it as just marginally higher than the risk from many other agents. So many of other antidepressants and certainly non-antidepressant medications have idiosyncratic bad reactions with people's liver on the range of about 1 out of 1 million times. Nefazodone's 3 or 4 times higher. Again, you should be aware of it and monitor for that, but it's not dramatically deadlier than our other medications. Furthermore, Nefazodone does not work like any other antidepressant on the market. It seems to be primarily blocking serotonin 2A receptors. It does have some weak serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake action, but it does not work like anything else out there. In my experience, about 1% of my patients over 30 years responded to Serzone, Nefazodone, and not anything else. Many of these individuals had been on more than 10 or 12 other antidepressants from every other available class, had not responded to them, got good, dramatic, sustained responses to Nefazodone. And as we saw about 2 years ago when there were production shortages by the one maker in the world, which is a generic Teva Pharmaceuticals, there was no Nefazodone on the market for more than a year. Some people had stockpiled supplies, some didn't. Many had to cut back on their dose or stop. Many people became depressed and nothing else. Some of them did respond to new agents. Many of the ones I had individual contact with, and there's online support groups, nothing else helped them. And some of these people did become suicidal when deprived of the Nefazodone. So yes, there's a danger, but when we were over-alarmed by the danger posed by liver failure, almost certainly more people have died as a result of not having access to Nefazodone in other countries, than would have died from liver failure because of this. So the alarming thing is that all of these changes occurred in an era which continues to this day, it's about to end, I think, of the FDA, where there's a revolving door between academic medicine, drug company workers, and people working at regulatory agencies. The FDA clearly has a bias towards pharmaceutical companies, and I do think most of the individuals there do try to do an accurate assessment of risks and benefits, but there is a institutional bias towards working collaboratively with the drug agencies. I mean, interestingly, these stances that the FDA took were in an era where there was a pro-drug, pro-pharmacy bias, and yet the agency still took an anti-pharmaceutical company action that actually was the wrong action in retrospect. I'm not pretending at the time they could have known or foretold it, but it was clearly they acted against drug company interests, but they also wound up acting against the public health interest. What's really alarming is that the man-nominated RFK Jr., head of Health and Human Services, which is the agency that oversees the FDA, is clearly, repeatedly, vocally Big Pharma, antidepressants. So he's repeatedly claimed to think that we need to keep investigating a widely debunked and disproven association between mass murders in this country, mass shootings, and antidepressant use. Doesn't hold water. Countries, Portugal, Iceland, have rates of antidepressant use that are comparable to the US's. We are not an outlier. They do not have people rampaging through the streets, killing young males, particularly killing people with guns in either of those two countries. So RFK, Trump himself, the whole political movement they are riding on the crest of is avowedly anti-science, anti-experts. And the worry is there will be many more decisions made in the years ahead that are going to result in killing lots of people because they don't really care what the facts show. They just care whether their biases are being reinforced and carried out. So one thing to point out is I am not blaming the FDA for their original decision. I think they behaved with good intentions. All the evidence supports that. And figuring out future risks is difficult. You are trying to predict something that has not happened yet. All the implications of your action. But so often, and we saw this during the COVID pandemic, people look at one side of the equation and don't balance the risk of taking action versus the risk of not taking action or not treatment. Not treating depression kills people. Not preventing COVID kills people. The other thing that's difficult to acknowledge and balance is that there will be people harmed on either side of the equation regardless of your decision. There are people who did suffer grievous bodily harm and maybe even died as a result of vaccines for COVID. There are people who will die because they take an antidepressant, but many more will be saved or deaths prevented by both vaccinations and antidepressants than by not having them available. 3 is that I think there's both an anti-psychiatry, anti-mental health bias buried in some of this. So when someone dies from cardiac failure, from liver death, from suicide that's directly linked to a medication, it's really easy to draw a direct link and say, that's a bad drug, that's a bad effect of the drug. Yes. But it's much harder to balance that against, again, the life saved, the person who isn't dying of a cardiac death or suicide or anything else. So you're trying to balance a bad event versus all the bad events you've actually prevented, which are invisible because you've prevented them. And furthermore, again, there's a direct link between some of these bad effects of the drugs versus the bad effects that they are preventing. So even when they prevent a suicide death, I think that gets discounted because people say, well, the depression was contributing to their suicide, but also their early childhood and also the bad economy and also 14 other things are all contributing to that suicide death. So it's harder for people to give credit to the antidepressant for preventing that suicide death. So that's about all I have to say today. Stay healthy, stay happy. If you are feeling suicidal, 988 is the nationwide anonymous suicide hotline for helping you deal with and get beyond that crisis.